Yvonne.
Hey there.
Thanks for pinging me. Sorry about that. It's early. I have no excuse.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello.
Great. How's it going?
It's uh it's feeling early in the morning to me. Sorry about that.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. So today is August 12th, and what I wanted to show people today for the Porter community meeting was some of the new V1 features. But before I get into that, I just wanted to see if anyone had other stuff they want to talk about too before we show a demo.
Yeah. So, is there standards defined for mixins? Because Helm 3 mixin schema is not retaining any output, but Helm 2 mixin does. So, is there a standard defined, or I was just looking through the code and yeah, so Helm 2 does print the schema to standard output, but Helm 3 mixin is using Packer module to write it to schema.json file.
Um, are you asking if the schema command is standardized or
Yep.
if, whether or not you use Packer?
Yeah, is that standardized?
So going forward, we encourage people to implement it using Go embed,
Okay.
and we've started doing that in V1 of Porter.
Okay.
Packer is what works on Go 1.15 at the moment, so that's what older mixins are using.
Mm.
It's fine if people want to switch. We do want all mixins to implement schema, but it's not required because it doesn't impact the execution of the mixin. It's helpful for showing autocomplete in an editor.
Cool. Yeah. Okay.
So sorry, I'm just getting my machine ready to show you V1 stuff. Because there's a lot of in-flight things. Vaughn can attest to that. Okay. So let me share my screen. Boop, boop, boop. Cool. So this is going to be showing code built on my machine. We don't have a release yet for V1 with these features. A lot of them interact with each other, and we want to make sure we get all the changes we need kind of grouped together before we cut another release. So let me just build and install this. And so what I wanted to show is that we now have the ability to group data by a namespace. This is very similar to how you do namespaces in Kubernetes, but there's a couple slight differences. It's not one-to-one exactly the same. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So here I'm just listing the installations that I have on my machine. This is just random dev data. And we have a new column here. As you can see, it's namespace. And right now it's showing everything dev. We have another flag now. All namespaces though. And you can see everything. So you can see that by default, I was just looking at the dev namespace. And now that I say all namespaces, I can see that I actually had another namespace, test, and I had done an installation there. So if I look at, oh, I'm sorry, I should make this bigger. If I look at my Porter config file for a second, you can see that my namespace is set to dev. There's a bunch of other new stuff in that config file, but we'll look at that in just a second. So what I could also do is porter list namespace test, and let me just look at that. The goal of these namespaces is to allow multiple users to coexist on a single Porter installation, essentially. Not the installation of the binary, but the set of installations that Porter manages. So you could have a team that maybe is sharing a bunch of installations that you manage, and some of those installations may be related to different environments like staging or test, or they may be associated with a specific developer. And it would be nice to be able to say, oh, these are mine. So let me show you an example of that. So I'm going to install a bundle. I'm going to call it Carolyn. And I'm going to use my favorite test bundle. It's just the hello one. Get Porter hello. But what I want to do is I'm going to label it and basically make it mine. Owner equals Carolyn. We'll use my username. Okay. So it installed it, and if I do Porter list here, we'll see Carolyn popped up. So let's look at that. And you can see now that it has a label. Now imagine I had there's a lot of people in an environment. It can be kind of hard to figure out like what's mine. So I can do Porter list and filter by a label where I can say owners Carolyn VS. And instead of seeing all of these, let's see what we get back this time. We just get back the one there. So now when we're doing things like list, you should be able to do a lot more filtering and things like that. So here's another filter we can do. Let's do name, and let's filter it to anything that had, I think, hello. So I had a couple that had the substring hello. Let me search for llama because I think that shows you a little bit better. It's not a prefix search, it's a substring search. Now everything I've showed you here for installations also works for credentials and parameters. So they also have namespace and all the flags and being able to label and things like that all still come into play for these as well, and same for parameters. Let's do so there we go. So you can still do the same filtering and everything that you were used to before. So this should help people find data a lot more quickly, especially when there's lots of installations, but it also lets you find data that's related to you or a specific environment or maybe an application that you're managing. So it should just be a lot easier. We didn't add this feature just to make it easier to find data though. We also added it primarily to support more advanced dependency scenarios in the future. This query capability, we're going to eventually provide this to bundle authors so that when they're authoring a bundle and they're specifying that they depend on another bundle being installed as well, they'll be able to use these queries to say, for example, I need a bundle an installation that has a certain label on it that's associated with a certain application. So for example, you could say, I rely on a MySQL database, but I want to rely on it in a specific namespace. For example, in the current namespace that you're installing another installation. So if I was installing WordPress, I could be like, I need another installation of MySQL, and I want it in my current namespace. Oh, and I want it to have this label on it. And it could be a very unique label that's specific to this installation of WordPress. And what that would do is Porter would do a search. It would look for it, just like you saw these list commands searching for an installation. And if it doesn't find one, it'll make a new one. If it does find it, it'll be able to reuse it. And that reusing of installations for resolving dependencies is what drove this entire feature.
Quick question, if we have time.
Of course.
Uh, and maybe you mentioned this, but I missed it. Are labels, do we anticipate labels could be defined in the bundle itself, like at author?
Oh yeah, that's an amazing question. Yeah. I am proposing a change to the specification for CNAB to have labels. Right now we support keywords on a bundle, but not a label. And I think we'd like to have basically a one-to-one mapping so that, let's say I have a bundle and it's a MySQL bundle, right? It'd be really cool to be able to label the bundle and say the version of MySQL that this bundle ships, it's 5.7.15, okay? And then when you install that bundle, what we'd like to have happen, I don't think it's in this build, is that it will transfer that label from the bundle to the installation so that when you're looking at the metadata on the installation, you would see what version of MySQL is actually installed, not the version of the bundle, but the actual software that bundle is shipping. But it's not implemented yet.
Awesome. That'll be handy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we use namespaces, but they aren't exactly the same as Kubernetes. And so let me go back and just chat for a little bit about what it looks like in Kubernetes. Kubernetes has a concept of a cluster level resource where it's not associated with any namespace. And then it has namespace scoped resources. And those would be like, pod or anything like that, deployment, a service where it's defined inside a namespace. A cluster scoped resource could be something like a cluster role, or a cluster role binding. And that's where you see things like, admin users and definitions like that hanging out. Porter does something a little different. An installation doesn't suddenly become different because it's scoped globally. Instead, what we do is we allow you to essentially set the namespace to empty. So let's try this. Let's install something here and we'll call it like shared thing. And we'll just use the hello bundle because it's not terribly relevant what bundle we're using here. Okay. But I'm going to set the namespace to the empty string. And what this lets me do is now when I go Porter list, and I'm going to look just here, I was able to define it outside of a namespace entirely. And this is functionally similar to a cluster scoped resource, but Porter is not about Kubernetes at all. It's not about clusters or anything. So this is just essentially what we call the global namespace, is that empty namespace. And when I'm working with installations and credentials and parameters, this is where things can get a little neat, is I can define, let's kind of see if I have one right now. Let's do parameters. Let's see, do I have any global parameters? Nope. Let's make one. And we'll call it llama. And we'll generate a set of parameters for another wonderful bundle called Hello Llama. This bundle is pretty much near equivalent to the hello bundle, but it has a parameter for the name when it says hello. So it'll say hello, whatever parameter you gave it. Okay. So when this bundle says hello, we'd like to say demo. Okay. So now let's take a look at our parameters again, all the ones that are global. Oh, I totally messed up there. I'm sorry. It would have really helped to do this when I ran that command. So let's try that again. Okay. Cool. I'm going to get rid of the other one. Let's see. Oh, thank goodness we have delete implemented. I was not 100% confident in that for a minute. Okay, there we go. So let's take a look at everything, for example. So parameters, list, all namespaces. You can also do -n, like star like that, but we have an all namespaces flag too. Okay. So in my current namespace, dev, I have a couple things defined, and I have one globally called llama. So now what I'd like to do is I'm going to do porter install. I'm going to install just another kind of random thing, but it's going to be in the dev namespace. Let's just be super clear about this. This is going into dev, and I'm going to call it dev llama. Okay. And I want to give it a parameter so that it says we have the word demo set up for ours. So I want to reference a parameter, and we called it llama. Porter will do 2 checks to resolve this parameter because we're referencing it by name. The first check is it's going to look in the namespace where you're doing the installation, and it's going to look for a parameter set called llama in the dev namespace, in my current namespace. If it finds it, it'll use it. Great. If it doesn't find a local parameter set with the name that you asked for, it's going to look at the global namespace. And what this allows you to do with your team is to define common credentials or common parameter sets for your team and allow them to use it. So let's give this a try. Hopefully it actually works. Oh no! Okay, this may be the build I'm on. Sorry about that. This is kind of all local.
What about
By
your
the time
bundle?
we ship the release, probably next week, it'll be working. But that's the idea, is that you should be able to reference things like that. So if let's see if I cheat here. Oh, this is the joy of doing a demo off of a local dev build.
No, you just need the Porter Llama bundle instead.
Oh, thank you.
Or Hello Llama or whatever.
Thanks. Okay.
Yep.
That's what it is. Hello Llama. Okay, there we go. And it said Nemo. It said hi. I wonder if that fixes it for the other one. Should we check and see? I don't think it'll fix it though, but it's always interesting. Nah. So once we ship it though, it will find it and it'll use the one that's defined at the global level. So it shows you namespaces and labels, and you can assign labels to credential sets and parameter sets too, by the way. It works exactly the same. In order to support all of this querying capabilities, we also needed to completely change Porter's backend data storage. So this is a very big change. So let's look at that config file again. So I'm going to look at my config file for Porter, and I'm going to immediately delete this. Oops. I'm going to delete that as soon as this is over. We have a couple new things here. And what it is it's a new type of storage plugin. By default, it'll use this new plugin that's called MongoDB Docker. And that kind of gives away our new backend is no longer flat file storage. It no longer will work with things like S3 or blob storage. Instead, what you'll need is a Mongo database. So when you're running locally and you're just trying out Porter for the first time, you don't actually need to install anything extra. We'll use Docker and spin up a Mongo database for you and use it. And that's what I'm working with here when you saw me running all these commands. There's another plugin that's just called Mongo without the Docker suffix. Just like you think, it lets you connect to an external Mongo database and use that. We switched to Mongo because it supports querying, essentially. Flat file is not fun to query at scale at all, and I think a lot of people saw performance problems with like the Azure plugin, for example, because we were having to do a lot of queries in order to support any type of interesting filtering in the CLI. So these two plugins are built into Porter. You don't actually need to install them at all. And they replace the MongoDB Docker one, replaces the file system plugin. That'll be gone entirely. So when you go to try out this, you're probably going to want to go into your config file and see if you had explicitly set the driver to, the plugin to file system. And either just remove that config and it'll just fall back and use Docker for you, or you can explicitly configure something as well. So I'm going to switch what I'm sharing here for a second so you can see what this looks like in our database. Cool. I don't know if I can make this bigger. Whoa, I can. Great. Is that more readable? Cool. So let's take a look at, I have a smoke test database here, which has some data in it. And it kind of looks a lot like the flat file. You're going to see a collection for credentials. You're going to see a collection for your parameters and your installations. The others are like associated data for the installations, outputs, results, and runs, all kind of go along with that. So if I look at my installations, I can see that I've installed, here, let's go to the other one because I think we had a lot more data. Nope. Okay. Smoke test is where all my data is hiding. I have a hello bundle that's been installed and our favorite test bundle, my buns, which that test string will never go away. And you'll be able to see information on it. And this is just a lot easier to traverse and look at and kind of find things. And pretty much everything goes by IDs, so you can kind of correlate off of things and find stuff and do full queries and everything. So it's just a lot easier for someone to make use of their backend data as well if you want to query it yourself and work with it or troubleshoot and figure out, you know, why things are acting a little wonky or broken. One thing to call out is we do store outputs in the database as well. Depending on the size of your bundle outputs, this may be a deal, like a thing. Because obviously storing ginormous, you know, gigabyte size outputs or things like that in Mongo would probably not be the best idea. So in the future, we may offer you the ability to kind of prune and get rid of things if they're ginormous, or just say we don't want to store ginormous things in the database, etc. May need to get creative down the road. But in the meantime, just kind of be aware that that's going to be a thing potentially. Any questions?
What was this graphical tool called? Is it MongoDB Compass?
Compass, yeah. It's really nice for looking at things. My favorite is that, let's look at installations for a second. It shows you the indices that have been defined on it as well. And it can use the indices to tell you, I'm going to run a query. So here's a query. I'm going to just look for name hello, for example. And it'll tell me if it's actually going to use the index when you run it. This is really great for dev as we're working on implementing more query capabilities to understand if our indexes are good or not. So for example, we didn't end up using one for this query. Well, what if I do this? We'll do empty one. Now you see it picked up the index. So this is fun to learn about when indices are used, when they're not, how to figure out how to optimize your queries to make sure that as often as possible, they actually do use the index. I tuned all the indices that are on these collections based on the queries that Porter is going to make and the data it has available. So instead of, for example, instead of adding another index that just had name in it, right? Porter actually always has the namespace. We always have that, either the one you configured inside of your config file or with the flag, right? So we can always provide the name and the namespace when we do our queries. So it was fine to be able to just reuse this for everything. It does mean in some situations you may be adding fields to your query that maybe weren't strictly necessary, but it matched the index better. So we had the data, we could include that extra data and then get an index hit, which is nice. So yeah, this UI is just great. Like, I totally recommend it as you're working on things, or just kind of poking around and seeing, you know, what data is in the database. I'm trying to think if we have any other new things to show. I don't think so.
These are some big items.
I mean, it was a lot of work. And it feels almost anticlimactic when you're like, look, we could filter by namespace. But
It only feels like that because it just works so smoothly, and now it just seems totally, it just makes sense. Like, this is what you wanted for some time, and the file system default, you know, the old storage style just didn't support it.
yeah, maybe we should talk about that a little bit more. So CNAB specifies some things and not others, right? For example, it specifies what is the format of a bundle, you know, what goes into bundle.json. And it specifies a lot of behavior on how you should run a bundle. And all this is really great because it allows you to make a bundle once, you know, publish it to a registry, and then different tools, different implementations of the spec can all execute your bundle, and you should expect that it'll run the same and it should be runnable. There are other things in the spec that sometimes talk about things that aren't related to runtime. For example, credential sets are described in the spec in what's called a non-normative section, and that means it's just advice. No one has to follow it. And part of the reason why it is non-normative is because as far as the runtime of CNAB is concerned, credential sets don't exist. There's something that is a convenient implementation that was suggested to tools that they could use. But by the time a bundle is running, there's no such thing as a credential set. The tool has already decomposed it, resolved values, and then injected them into the container. And so what we discovered is we had things implemented in CNAB Go that were useful to implementers, right? We had a definition for a credential set. We had a definition for a claim or for a result, things like that. And we also had data structures that would make it like you'd have an out-of-the-box implementation of storing and retrieving those documents as well. And what we ran into is that it was so generic because it was just in this library, CNAB Go. It had no concept of data access patterns or what you're storing it in. It wasn't designed at all to query or anything like that. So the biggest part of the change is those things, this hasn't been committed yet to CNAB Go. We're still feeling things out, but all of those things I just mentioned won't be in CNAB Go. The only thing that'll be in there are documents that are defined by the spec officially and are used by the runtime so that people can implement the runtime with CNAB Go. So now, for example, the definition for installation or the definition for credential set, parameter set, and then all the code necessary to support all those queries you just saw. It's stored inside Porter. And every implementation will have slightly different things because you need to be able to optimize for this. We were getting hit really hard with performance problems because we had essentially like the lowest common denominator of how to work with the data in that CNAB library. So this kind of frees us from that. And in the future, if we find useful abstractions that other tools are interested in using as well, we can find a way to share. But for now, like we had to fix, we needed the capability of querying, period. And we also needed to fix performance problems, which is why a lot of code, when I commit this, is going to be moving out of CNAB Go and into Porter. I'm like explaining this for future people. Sorry, in case anyone watches this video. And I think next week at the CNAB meeting, I'll be going all over this slightly more polished, hopefully, maybe with some visuals to help explain it. Make sure everyone's on board before I submit the PRs for this. The PRs to CNAB Go are going to kind of be in big batches though, because we want to vet everything about our solution first before we try to make big upstream changes, right? We don't want to go back and go, oops, actually, it needed to look like this instead of that. That's not going to be helpful. So Porter will be working off of a fork of CNAB Go probably for the next month. And then speaking of lag, changes to the CNAB spec will also lag behind this because we're definitely not going to suggest to change the spec until we've seen it work all the way through in Porter. We're seeing things work for like simple commands like list and everything. But as you saw, like install isn't quite there yet. And we have bigger plans for desired state and automatically reconciling changes and running bundles for you. And all those things could potentially impact the spec as well. That's all I had, unless there's any questions or other stuff people want to bring up. I'm just imagining wild applause on the other side of the Zoom.
Wait a second, I got it. There we go. I wish we could get a soundtrack for the clap.
I know, it should have a sound effect when you do that. Or even just like a sad doink noise. Just, I need like the boom, stuff like that. There's probably something out there already with like a Staples easy button if I could just find it. Life goals. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. I guess the most important thing is if you want to try this out, we haven't shipped a new release of the V1 Alpha yet. I'm thinking that'll probably come next week so people can try it. The biggest thing to know when you try it is that it's not meant to be used with any of your real data right now. Obviously, this is an entire data migration, and we're not done yet. So when we do eventually cut a new release, it's going to start over. It's not going to migrate your data for you. And so you'll be able to use it and try it. Don't use it in production. Don't use it anywhere where you care about keeping that data, because the data won't live. We're not going to offer migrations for it. When we're ready to release V1, that's when there'll be a data migration, when we're done tinkering with the format. Did I miss anything on that, Vaughn?
Nope, I'm just adding
Cool.
notes around
Thank
this.
you. Yeah. It's just to play with. It's not, don't put any real data in this because no one's going to help you migrate it. But I would love it if someone could, compile it locally, try it out, wait for next week, run it then, and just kind of, submit bugs, thoughts, ideas, feature requests, whatever. All right, now I'm ready to end the meeting, Vaughn. I just had to threaten people's data first. I had to get that out of my system. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and hope I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.